Biden had said America is back after coming to power. However, after over 8 months of Biden's presidency, the US is getting kicked out of the Middle East and the North Africa region. Now, Putin has driven a deep wedge between Israel and the US over Sudan. A military regime has been installed in Sudan. Russia supports it. Israel also supports it. And only the US opposes it. So how did Putin manage this great diplomatic exploit? Keep watching to find out. Hi and welcome to TFI Global, the foreign affairs and geopolitical analysis arm of the TFI Media Group. I'm your host Atul Mishra, and in this video I will tell you how a coup in Sudan is bringing Russia and Israel closer despite US resentment. Let's begin. Sudan has gone through yet another sweeping political change, and everyone, including Russia and Israel, seem to be happy about it. If there is any loser in the entire bargain, it is the United States President Joe Biden. On Monday, the Sudanese military detained Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok and other members of the transitional government in the African country. The military has declared a state of emergency, which means the transitional government has been replaced by a military regime. The coup has therefore turned out to be a boon for Russia and Israel, but it further ostracized the US in the African continent. Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who led the coup by Sudanese military against the transitional government, has announced the introduction of a state of emergency in Sudan. He also dissolved the African country's so-called Transitional Sovereign Council and the government. The events in Sudan have been reportedly welcomed with cautious optimism in Moscow. Russian officials haven't recognized the regime change in Sudan till now, but the reaction of Russian officials suggests that the Sudanese military has Moscow's backing. First Deputy Permanent Representative of Russia to the UN, Dmitry Polyansky, said, "It is hard to say if this is a coup or not. The term coup has a specific definition. There are situations like that of Sudan in many parts of the world that are not called a coup. This is sometimes called a change of power. It is up to the Sudanese people to decide whether it is coup or not." Justifying efforts by the Sudanese military to repress the ongoing protests in the country, the Russian officials added, "As far as I can see, there are not only peaceful protests but also violent protests." Russia, on its part, has every reason to rejoice in the military coup. Moscow maintains a good relationship with the Sudanese military. In April 2019, the Sudanese military had overthrown President and longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir. A month later, the Sudanese military agreed to the construction of a Russian military base in Sudan. However, the transitional government in Sudan was developing cold feet on the question of developing a Russian naval base. The civilian governments were putting forward new conditions which enraged Moscow and led Russian officials to believe that Sudan was acting under the influence of Western powers. The coup in Sudan will now help Russia facilitate the construction of its military base in the war-torn country. The United States is particularly unhappy about the coup in Sudan. The US Department of State has stated, "The United States strongly condemns the actions of the Sudanese military forces. We firmly reject the dissolution of the civilian-led transitional government and its associated institutions and call for their immediate restoration. The arrest of Prime Minister Hamdok and other civilian leaders is unacceptable. The military forces must ensure their safety and release them immediately. These actions have the potential to derail the country's transition to democracy and are a betrayal of Sudan's peaceful revolution." Before the coup, Sudan was getting closer to the United States of America. Only last year, it had normalized its relations with the Jewish nation of Israel by signing a Donald Trump-mediated Abraham Accord. In return, the US had promised economic aid worth $300 million and $3 billion in debt relief and investment to Sudan, apart from removing the African country from the US terror list. To many, the Sudan-Israel-Abraham Accord signed last year meant a diplomatic victory for the US. Washington, D.C. has had a long history of conflict with Sudan, which was put on the US terror list in 1993, partly due to the African country's alleged ties with terrorists like Osama bin Laden. 2 years later, the then US President Bill Clinton had imposed punitive sanctions on Khartoum, and in 1998, Clinton had ordered a missile strike on the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Khartoum, Sudan, as a retaliation against the bombing of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania by Osama bin Laden loyalists. Bill Clinton administration had then argued that Al-Shifa, the pharmaceutical plant, was targeted because it was used as a terror base. However, later on it was proved that the Khartoum-based pharma plant had no terror ties. Finally, the Arab Spring reached Sudan in 2011. like many other countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. In 2011 itself, South Sudan seceded from Sudan and took away much of its oil reserves. Later, in 2019, the longtime US foe, former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir was overthrown by the military and a transitional government was put in place to lead the country towards democracy. Toppling Omar and establishment of a transitional government in Khartoum was a victory for the United States. This is why the US is fuming due to the exit of Omar al-Bashir. Israel is the biggest non-Muslim ally of the United States in the MENA region. Yet Israel hasn't opposed the coup, while the US is crying foul. The fact remains that Israel considers the Sudanese military a great friend. During the run-up to normalization of relations between Israel and Sudan, the civilian government led by Abdullah Hamdok was reluctant to embrace the Jewish nation due to the adverse public opinion, while the Sudanese military seemed favorable. Jerusalem maintained close ties with the Sudanese army and intelligence to push through the normalization of relations. Also, former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu even met Sudan's military general Abdel Fattah al-Burhan in Uganda in a bid to promote bilateral military ties. The Israeli security establishment therefore feels that Sudanese military is a faithful ally, even though it is not in the good books of the United States. Meanwhile, Barak Ravid, an Israeli journalist, has tweeted, several Israeli government officials have been stirring up domestic politics in Sudan in recent weeks. This raises big question marks about what Israel knew about what is happening now in Khartoum and how much its moves have affected what is happening now. Israel's reaction is thus an indication of how the Jewish nation is ready to cooperate with Russia. Israel's relationship with Moscow has always been friendly, excepting a brief period of military conflict in the late 1960s at the peak of the Cold War. Despite being a US ally, Israel is cooperating with Russia in the MENA region. Sudan is a poor African country located in the Sahel region that is characterized by Islamist extremism and civil conflict between Muslim and Christian communities. Located in the Sahara Desert and tropical Africa, the Sahel region has a semi-arid topography and unpredictable weather vulnerable to frequent droughts. Sudan is no exception. Yet, Sudan is becoming a hub of global power competition, as the recent coup has shown. Powers like Russia, the US, and China are deeply involved in Sudan. Even though the oil-rich Sudanese region went to South Sudan, there is still some availability of oil, which makes the global powers very interested. Much of the Russian and Chinese interest in Sudan is related to Darfur, a region located in the western Sudan, which is presently going through the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Sudan's Darfur has witnessed thousands of deaths and displacement of over 2 million people due to environmental degradation and ethnic conflicts. However, Darfur is also believed to have lots of oil, an estimated 5 to 15 billion barrels waiting to be explored. Chinese state-owned oil companies have been in talks with Sudan to help it extract oil from the Darfur region. Russian private military contractors too were reported to be operating in the Darfur region in 2018. Therefore, by backing a regime change in Sudan, Russia can also outcompete China when it comes to extracting oil from Sudan's Darfur region. Sudan is a poor nation, ravaged by conflicts and wars. However, all global powers, including Russia, China, Israel, and the US, want to shore up their influence in Khartoum for individual reasons. However, it is Moscow and Jerusalem who presently seem to be succeeding in their plans.